Alright, I am starting off where I left off at on page 247 at Lifestyle and Teachers, section 8.4. Teachers bring into their classroom more than their minds and their lesson plans. They bring their attitudes and values. Elementary and secondary teachers traditionally have been considered extensions of the family in passing onto the young community's positive values. In past generations, teachers who behaved in ways counter to the community's values were dismissed out of hand. Teachers were summarily fired for homosexuality, being single and pregnant, living with someone of the opposite sex, using illegal drugs, being publicly drunk, or committing a crime. However, the late 1960s saw a shift in the balance between the community's right to require certain standards of behavior and the rights of individuals to pursue their own lifestyles and values. Although the law in some areas has not yet been settled on many questions, judicial opinion is increasingly clear. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the courts tended to rule in favor of teachers' rights to do what they wished with their hair. More recently, the courts have often sided with school districts' right to impose reasonable grooming codes for teachers. Teachers, according to the current view, do not have a constitutional right concerning their style of plumage. The situation is similar for clothing. Courts have upheld district judgments on skirts that are considered too short and requirements that male teachers wear neckties. Courts are asserting that the First Amendment does not extend to sartorial choice. For health reasons, obesity may be its own punishment, but does a school district have a right to fire a teacher because it decides he or she is too fat? A California school district released a 42-year-old female physical education teacher because at 5 feet 7 inches and 225 pounds, the district felt she was unfit for service. Our principal argued that she did not serve as a model of health and vigor and was restricted in her ability to perform on the trampoline in gymnastics and modern dance and in other aspects of the program. In this case, the court sided with the teacher, claiming that the district had not proved that her girth had impaired her performance. In the past, sexual behavior was considered an area in which a community had a complete right to impose its standards on people selected to reach its children. More recently, the courts have increasingly viewed teachers' private sexual habits or preferences as separate from their public professional lives as teachers. One landmark case involved Mark Morrison, who was fired after his former lover, another male teacher, reported their brief relationship to the superintendent. The school district believed it was on solid ground in dismissing Morrison for several reasons. The district representatives argued that California's law requiring teachers to be models of good conduct applied to the case, that teachers are required to impress on their charges principles of morality, and that homosexual behavior is contrary to the moral standards of the people of California. In 1969, the California Supreme Court ruled in Morrison's favor. It acknowledged that homosexuality is, for many people, an uncertain or controversial area of morality. Nevertheless, the court made an important distinction between a teacher's private life and his or her professional performance, as there was no evidence that Morrison's sexual orientation had ever been part of his relationship with his students, or in any way affected the performance of his teaching duties, or affected his relationships with his fellow teachers. He was reinstated. Although there are no new dramatic shifts in the law, what LGBT teachers can and cannot do in their professional status is being given substantial attention among activists and lawyers. Similarly, cases involving pregnancy out of wedlock and unmarried couples living together have been settled in favor of the individual teacher. To win such a case, however, the conditions just cited are required. Specifically, the behavior must not intrude into the classroom or seriously affect the teacher's professional performance. A teacher would be misguided to think that his or her behavior after school hours is always protected under the law. For example, a tenured California teacher was fired after she was arrested by an undercover policeman for engaging in sexual activity at a swingers club. California state courts ruled that her behavior at this semi-public party showed a lack of concern for decorum or preservation of her dignity and reputation, and that she demonstrated a serious lack of normal prudence and good common sense. Flaunting one's deviation from the community standards tends to increase the chances that courts will uphold dismissal. In all these cases, however, circumstances play a crucial role in the court's final opinion. Whereas the courts have become increasingly lenient on issues of private sexual behavior, the line is being held firm with regard to socially unacceptable behavior that spills over into the classroom. One sure way to lose one's teaching position is to make a sexual advance or engage in any kind of sexual relationship with the student. Unless, usually, even a single incident is enough to sustain a dismissal. The same goes for smoking marijuana for recreational purposes, taking other drugs, public drinking to the point of drunkenness, or even using excessively obscene language in the presence of students. In this area, teachers bear the full weight of their responsibility to be a role model. Teachers should also realize that they can become over-involved with students, even when no sexual impropriety has occurred. A fourth-grade teacher, Drew Curran, was dismissed from his job when he became so involved with one of his students that he sued the boy's mother for custody. The child had been allowed to live with the teacher for 9 months, but when the mother wanted her son to return home, Curran filed suit for custody. The custody battle generated so much publicity that the district fired him. Curran was found to have exploited his position as a teacher, which provided just cause for termination. In general, except in matters of personal appearance, the courts are allowing teachers a good degree of freedom in their private and personal lifestyles, as long as their choices and behavior do not adversely affect their performance as teachers. Table 8.1 summarizes the court cases and rulings discussed in this and the previous sections. According to the First Amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. During the past 2 centuries, the U.S. judicial system had interpreted this amendment inconsistently with respect to the place of religion in public schools, a topic of high controversy and the cause of much public unrest in recent years. This controversy is not a new one. The role of religion has been a bone of contention since the beginning of public education in the United States. Among the questions currently being asked are the following. Which religious observances, if any, are permitted in public school classrooms? Is a prayer, public and private, illegal in public schools? Are extracurricular religious clubs allowed in public schools? May parents insist that schools provide alternate textbooks consistent with their religious beliefs? Until the mid-20th century, religious observances, including Bible reading and prayers, were common in the public schools. In fact, Bible reading and the recitation of the Lord's Prayer was required by constitutions or by statutes in a number of states. In Abington School District versus Shemp, however, the Supreme Court ruled both to be unconstitutional. In a 1962 decision, the court had already ruled against the recitation of a non-denominational prayer, holding that Bible reading and prayer violate both clauses of the First Amendment. The court recognized that the schools involved did not compel a child to join in religious activities if his or her parents objected. Nevertheless, it held that the social pressures exerted on pupils to participate were excessive. In essence, no distinction was believed to exist between voluntary and compulsory participation in religious activities. The court did not note that the study of comparative religion, the history of religion, and the relationship of religion to civilization were not prohibited by this decision. It would also appear that although the Bible may not be used to teach religion, it might, if objectively presented, be used in such areas of study as history, civics, and literature. Indeed, most thoughtful people would agree that failure to be conservant with the Old and New Testaments making understanding of Western history and literature impossible. In the same way, if a student set out to learn about Chinese culture and was not permitted to read Confucius, he or she would be doomed to a very limited understanding. The court has also affirmed the right of individual public school pupils who so desire to say prayers and read scriptures of their choice in the morning before school start or after the regular school day has ended. As discussed in the next section, many students join clubs or groups for these activities. If prayers are said during lunch period, they must be silent. Many students who are religious continue to seek avenues for expression of beliefs within the public school day, whereas other students and their families campaign to avoid mixing religious expression with school activities. The daily recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance has been controversial in some quarters for several decades. Originally challenged on the ground that the compulsory recitation of the pledge is unconstitutionally coerced allegiance to the country, courts allowed students to opt out of reciting it. This was not enough for a California atheist father who did not want his third-grade daughter to listen to the pledge's phrase, "under God." In an extremely controversial ruling in June 2002, the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which has the 9 Western states under its jurisdiction, banned the teacher-led pledge for the nearly 10 million public school children 2 years later, in 2004, the Supreme Court rejected the father's case on a technicality. The ban imposed by the 19th Circuit Court has been lifted until the Supreme Court issues a final ruling. The Supreme Court has also determined that the recitation of prayers at a public school function is unconstitutional. In the Lee v. Wiseman case, the principal of a public middle school, Robert Lee, had invited a rabbi to say a benediction and invocation at the middle school graduation exercises, instructing the rabbi to offer non-sanctionary prayers. Student Deborah Reisman and her father filed a suit in court seeking a permanent injunction against including prayer and graduation ceremonies. The court used the following facts to reach its decision. Public school officials directed the performance of formal religious exercises at the graduation ceremonies, and although such exercises do not require attendance, they are in a real sense obligatory for all students, even those who object. As a result, the court upheld the decision of the lower court, ruling that it is unconstitutional to include clergy members who offer prayers as part of school graduation ceremonies. What if the students themselves select the prayer or the person delivering the prayer at after-school events? In 2000, the court ruled that student-initiated prayer at football games violates the First Amendment in part because attending school football games is mandatory for some students, such as athletes, cheerleaders, and band members, and other students who might object to the prayers feel social pressure and a genuine desire to participate in high school football. Nevertheless, students who are religious continue to seek avenues for expressions of beliefs within the public school day. Our extracurricular religious clubs legal in public schools? Court decisions provide no clear guidelines here. In at least one case, a district judge ruled in favor of such clubs based on students' right to free speech. A U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals later overturned the decision, maintaining that such clubs violate the First Amendment's Establishment of Religion Clause. The U.S. Supreme Court did not clear the waters. The 5-justice majority upheld district court opinion on a technical point, but declined to comment on the constitutional issue raised. In yet another case, the Board of Education v. Westside Community Schools v. Mergens, the court ruled that extracurricular religious group meetings held on public school grounds do not necessarily violate the U.S. Constitution. The court stated that if the school provides a limited public space for other non-curriculum student groups, then under the Equal Access Act, a student religious group may also use the school building for its meetings. Under these circumstances, a student religious group meeting in the cafeteria after school does not violate the constitutional separation of church and state. Subsequent court rulings have supported students' right to use school facilities for religious club meetings, even if the club is directed by adults. The Supreme Court ruled that a school district could not prohibit the Good News Club, a private Christian organization for children 6 to 12 years old, from meeting in a school building after school hours. The court stated that the school district had already adopted a policy of board community access to its schools, and in doing so had created an open forum. Prohibiting the club from meeting violated the club's First Amendment right of free speech. Although a key point in the Good News Club decision was that teachers do not participate in such meetings, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals in St. Louis later ruled that a teacher may, on his or her own time, lead such religious meetings after school. The many court cases dealing with prayer in school, extracurricular clubs, and the presence of the Bible in schools, as well as the publicity surrounding them, have had a chilling effect on teachers and administrators. Rather than get involved with what is clearly a controversial set of issues, many public educators have tended to discourage any expression or even mention of religious issues or topics. This in turn has caused a reaction from parents and others who think that by ignoring the religious dimension of life, the public schools create a distorted and ultimately dangerous view of humankind, a view labeled secular humanism. Secular humanism asserts the dignity of human beings but ignores the idea of God and the spiritual. Objecting to what they see as the prevailing secular humanism of the schools, some parents contend that such fundamental questions as what is a person's true nature and what is a life well lived can be treated in schools from every perspective except the religious view. They claim that this presentation is not only intellectually unbalanced but also poses a danger to their children. Speaking to this issue, one legal scholar has written, "When government imposes the content of school, it becomes the same deadening agent of of repression from which the framers of the Constitution sought to free themselves. Many parents are voting not only with their pocketbooks by turning down school budgets and tax requests for public schooling, but also with their feet by walking away from the public school system. This trend had fueled a dramatic growth in religious schools, and particularly in homeschooling in recent years. Specific objections to secular humanism in the schools have taken a number of forms. Two examples are the controversies over teaching about the origin of the human race and the debates over the use of certain textbooks. Major concern over the teaching of evolution dates to the famous 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee, in which a high school biology teacher, John Scopes, was accused of illegally teaching the theory of evolution. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, but the verdict was later overturned on a technicality. Although the trial came to national attention at the time, it did not set any legal precedent. The issue returned to the public eye later in the century when citizens asked for equal time for the biblical account of creation. In 1982, the Louisiana legislature passed the Balanced Treatment for Creation Science and Evolution Science Act, which quickly came to be known as the Balanced Treatment Act. The act defined scientific creationism as the belief that the origins of the elements, the galaxy, and the solar system of life, of all the species of plants and animals, the origin of man, and the origin of all things from their processes and relationships were created ex nihilo and fixed by God. In addition to requiring that scientific creationism be taught whenever evolution was taught, the act required the development of curriculum guides and research services for teaching creationism. At the same time, the act provided none of these resources or protections for those teaching evolution. After several challenges and lower court rulings, a case testing this act, Edwards v. Aguillard, reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1987, the justices ruled 7-2 against the Balanced Treatment Act. According to the court, the Balanced Treatment Act was in fact not balanced because its provision favored the teachings of creationism over evolution. Further, the court asserted the Balanced Treatment Act was motivated by the legislators' desire to promote a particular religious viewpoint which violated the Constitution's provisions against the establishment of a state-sponsored religion. Despite the court's ruling, few observers think this controversy has been fully settled. For example, in 1999 and again in 2005, the Kansas Board of Education voted to drop the requirement in the state's academic standards that evolution be taught in public schools. However, in 2013, the board voted to include the teaching of evolution in its standards. For several years, the creationism versus evolution clash had been the battleground between those who believe the public schools have become anti-religious and are promoting secularism, and those who are open to the school's teaching of religious point of view. Recently, this controversy has taken a somewhat different turn with the introduction of intelligent design theory. This theory suggests that some biological structures and other aspects of nature are so complex and so highly interdependent that they could not have been developed through Darwin evolution or undirected natural causes. Intelligent design theorists believe there is evidence that an intelligence either created or somehow guided their development. Although this theory differs from creationism on several points, it is quite compatible with the belief in God and is frequently explicitly linked with such a belief. Some of the scientific community have criticized intelligent design as mere speculation and a violation of scientific principles because it relies on pre-existing causes to explain natural phenomena. Whatever its merits, intelligent design theory has pumped new life into the arguments put forth by those who believe the public school curriculum, and the science curriculum in particular, have been de facto anti-religious. Recent court cases have been launched by fundamentalist Christian parents who argue that texts used in their children's public school classes are anti-Christian and therefore a violation of their children's constitutional rights. In a 1986 Tennessee case, a U.S. district judge agreed that the students' constitutional rights were violated when they were expelled after they refused to read certain texts. The following year, a U.S. Court of Appeals reversed the decision of the lower court, ruling that the text in question did not promote or require a person to accept any religion. Shortly thereafter, another challenge to the public schools' choice of textbooks was made in Alabama by fundamentalist parents, students, and teachers. 44 textbooks used in history, social studies, and home economic courses were cited as advancing secular humanism. In this case, the court rulings followed a pattern similar to that of the Tennessee case just described. Initially, the district court ruled that secular humanism is a religion and that some of the textbooks in question did discriminate against theistic religion. On appeal, this decision was reversed, and the court ruled that the textbooks promoted neither secularism nor any other religion. Table 8.2 summarizes the court rulings on religion in the public schools. When all the cases are considered together, teachers may very well be confused about what they can and cannot do. Thank goodness some attempts have been made to establish guidelines for teachers in schools. Thomas McDaniel recommends a religious neutrality principle in the classroom and offers 4 guidelines for putting it into practice. Students may not be required to salute the flag or to stand for the flag salute if this behavior conflicts with their religious beliefs. Bible reading, even without comment, may not be practiced in a public school when the intent is to promote worship. Prayer is an act of worship and as such cannot be a regular part of opening exercises or other aspects of a regular school day. Worship services such as prayer and Bible reading are not constitutional, even if voluntary rather than compulsory. Consensus majority vote or excusing objectors from class or participation does not make these practices legal. This principle of religion neutrality does not mean that the public school must completely ignore religion. On the contrary, teachers in public schools are free to study the history and contributions of individual religions with their students, to have them read the Bible as literature, and in general to expose students to our culture's religious heritage. It is only when teachers cross the line by advocating particular religion or involving students in prayer that they become vulnerable to legal action. A few years ago, as debate over such issues continued, the White House asked the Department of Education to issue a directive on religion in the public schools. The resulting guidelines are an attempt to find a new common ground between religious expression and religious freedom, and to correct the perception that schools are hostile to religion. Among the specific points listed in the guidelines are the following. Public schools should not interfere with or intrude on a family's religious beliefs. Public education should be respected of religion, open to appropriate religious expression, and should teach about religion because it is so very much a part of our nation's history. Advocacy of a particular religion by teachers and administrators has no place in public education. Students, religious clubs, and groups are entitled to hold meetings, to have common prayer, to read scriptures, and to have their meetings publicized through school bulletin boards, newspapers, and public address systems. Although school-sponsored prayer should not be permitted, it is appropriate to begin the school day with a moment of silence. A U.S. Department of Education directive gained teeth after the passage of the No Child Left Behind legislation. The directive contains a provision that federal funds will not be provided to a school district unless it stipulates in writing that it has no policy that prevents or otherwise denies participation in constitutionally protected prayer in public schools. Although this directive and the federal legislative support have been well received by many parents and educators, they have yet to be tested in the courts, nor do they address all of the conflicting issues surrounding religion in public schools. Many of the most important legal issues that affect the lives of teachers relate directly to students and their rights. Students, and particularly public school students, have a special status under the law. In this section, we touch on a few of the more significant student-related issues that can affect teachers. As described earlier in this chapter, for many years the courts used the legal principle of in loco parentis in cases involving students. Teachers following this principle are expected to treat their students in a caring and informal manner instead of in the formal and legalistic manner that governs relationships out in the world. By the same reasoning, because we do not require due process in the home, for a long time it was not valued in the schools. Gradually, though, decisions made in court cases, such as Tinker and others described in upcoming sections, the in loco parentis principle has been eroded, and the courts have come to appreciate that students often need to be protected from the arbitrary use of authority. As a direct result, many schools have developed clear statements governing procedures for expulsion, suspension, and student privacy, freedom of speech and publication, and various breaches of discipline. Informing students of the rules, procedures, and consequences of violations in these areas is a major step towards providing due process rights. Even so, the most important aspect of due process remains the spirit of fair and even-handed justice with which teachers respond to the daily events of the classroom. In terms of disciplinary matters relating to students, schools can operate on a continuum with regard to student due process. For trivial matters or emergencies, schools may act without due process. For matters that may result in a short suspension or some entry on the student's record, schools must use some measure of due process. For disciplinary matters that may result in long-term suspension or expulsion, they must demonstrate careful due process. Ever since schools came into existence, individual students have had difficulty following the rules and staying out of trouble. In recent decades, as schools have tried harder to keep older youth from dropping out, and as use of drugs and violence has increased in society as a whole, disciplinary problems within schools have escalated. Three of the most dramatic and horrible examples are the massacres that happened at Columbine High School in Colorado in 1999 and Virginia Tech in 2007, and the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton, Connecticut in 2012. Educators need to keep in mind that some students are severely troubled or deeply unhappy. Some, having been compelled to stay in school, find little to capture their imagination and to motivate them. For these students, school is a place of failure and frustration, and trouble is often close behind. Some of the more common forms of school infractions today are stealing, vandalizing school property, or someone's private property, bringing a weapon to school, possessing, using, or selling drugs or alcohol, fighting, and repeatedly disobeying the reasonable directives of teachers and other school personnel. School districts are not powerless in the face of these kinds of disciplinary breaches. For maintaining a safe and effective academic environment, schools have three disciplinary alternatives at their disposal: in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and expulsion. Typically, in-school suspension is for minor offenses and is brief in duration. Out-of-school suspension and expulsion are more serious and last for longer periods, with expulsion meaning complete separation from the school. This school district power must be wielded in a manner that ensures that students' constitutional rights and due process are protected. Recently, the U.S. Department of Education sent to U.S. schools a useful publication entitled Early Warning, Timely Response, a guide to safe schools. Not that only stresses prevention, but also offers helpful strategies for building good relationships with students. Nevertheless, it is in these areas, in the prevention of disruptions and violence, and in the administration of suspension and expulsion, that school administrators have frequently become entangled in lawsuits. One of the most important dismissal cases was Goss v. Lopez, a 1975 suspension case involving Dwight Lopez, a high school sophomore from Columbus, Ohio. Lopez was suspended for 10 days for allegedly becoming involved in a cafeteria disturbance. This suspension occurred without a hearing and without any prior notification. Although a suspension of this length and without a hearing or prior notice was in accord with the Ohio statutes, a suit was filed stating that Lopez's constitutional rights had been violated because he was not given any notice or hearing. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Lopez on the grounds that students facing suspension from a public school have property and liberty interests and therefore are protected by due process. In addition, the court stated that longer suspensions or expulsions for the remainder of the school term or permanently may require more formal procedures. In a 1988 lawsuit with some similar elements, Honig v. Doe, the court ruled against the California school officials. In this case, a school district had indefinitely suspended two emotionally disturbed students on the grounds that they were dangerous. The court ruled that this suspension was a violation of PL 94142, which allows school authorities to suspend dangerous students with disabilities for a maximum of 10 days. Longer suspensions require either the permission of parents or the consent of a federal judge. Because of the fear of school violence, which was exuberated by the Columbine and Virginia Tech school tragedies, a number of school districts have adopted zero-tolerance policies toward weapons, drugs, and school fightings, calling for automatic suspension or dismissal of student violators. Court cases involving zero tolerance have yet to be heard by the Supreme Court, although lower courts have already heard cases in which zero-tolerance policies have played a part. It would appear, however, from the 2008 federal court case, Murkowski versus the University of Delaware that the law is shifting towards supporting the school's responsibility to maintaining a safe and constructive learning environment. The case involved a college student who built a website and posted his own essays, such as his personal guide to sex and a graphic piece on how to skin a cat. In addition, his essays were filled with racist, anti-gay, and anti-Semitic comments. Dorm mates, claiming to be frightened by his behavior, complained to university officials. After a hearing, he was banned from the campus and required to undergo a mental health assessment. Murakowski insisted that his writings were satire and humor, and that the university was violating his constitutional protected rights. He sued, hoping to receive $59,000 in damages. He won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory for Mr. Murakowski. The court considered the university's actions amid the recent killings at Columbine High School in Virginia, and the climate of fear on campus awarded him a mere $10. A 2000 court case in Illinois, Fuller v. Decatur Public School Board of Education, School District 61, highlighted the zero-tolerance approach as well as the volatile issue of racial profiling. This school district, in accordance with its zero-tolerance policy on fighting, expelled a group of students for 2 years for starting a fight in the bleachers at a home football game. The fight, from all accounts, was brief but violent. 7 spectators were injured. The students argued that the expulsion was because of racial profiling. They were unfairly singled out. They argued because they were stereotyped as gang members. Further, they argued because no guns, knives, or drugs were involved. Their behavior did not merit an expulsion. The court ruled that the students failed to present any evidence that their expulsion was in any way based on race. Thus, although that court case found no evidence of racial profiling in the school's application of its zero-tolerance policy, it seems likely that future cases will involve both issues in school disciplinary actions. School dress codes are another area where students' rights and strict policies are clashing. In response to provocative and immodest student dress, these codes are being revised. Among the recent addition, no tank tops or tube tops, no low-riding, hip-hugging pants, no exposed midriff, no capri pants, no overalls, no pajama tops or bottoms, no sweatpants, no shirts with slogans or offensive illustrations, no athletic jerseys, no hats, no hooded sweatshirts. Belts are required unless the pants are skirt-like belt loops. Shirts and blouses should be tucked in at all times and should be long enough to stay tucked in. Although such a policy is difficult to enforce, as the Voices from the Classroom feature attests, educators are increasingly recognizing that there is a connection between edgy or over-the-line clothes and a school's poor learning environment. In my very first year as a teacher, I quickly realized the numerous and varied job responsibilities that undoubtedly come with the profession. On any given day, a teacher may be asked to be a coach, friend, counselor, helping hand, disciplinarian, or facilitator, to name just a few possible roles. What I did not realize quite so quickly, however, was the number of important decisions I would make on a regular basis. Many of these decisions carry moral, ethical, or legal implications. Consider, for example, the decisions involved in enforcing my public school's dress code. Although the U.S. Supreme Court has stated that students relinquish some of their First Amendment rights in school, teachers nonetheless struggle with the legal and ethical ramifications of controlling student dress and deeming what is appropriate or inappropriate attire for school. There are, of course, lots of theoretical, legal, and ethical questions surrounding dress codes such as these. Is it the responsibility of a public school to determine which attire is appropriate dress for school? Can a school still make this determination even if a parent objects or disagrees? How can a teacher make an objective and consistent decision for every student? These questions, which have deep moral, legal, and ethical significance, are worthy of thoughtful reflection and consideration by anyone entering the teaching profession. The situation becomes quite real, however, when the administration sets a specific dress code that I am expected to enforce when students enter my class first period in the morning. Can I tell a female high school student that her skirt is too short or that her shorts are more appropriate for the beach than for school? Or should I simply turn a blind eye to the situation, saving both the girl and me the embarrassment? Am I really doing my job by ignoring the situation? This is when teachers get the chance to truly define their own personal meanings for what seems like abstract legal and ethical questions. Freedom of speech issues related to dress code cut two ways. In response to the problems of students overdressing and underdressing, some schools have gone beyond dress codes and now require school uniforms. These policies are particularly popular in large cities. Currently, New York, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Miami, and Los Angeles have uniform policies. Not surprisingly, many parents and students are suing their districts over these policies, claiming having to wear a uniform is an abridgment of their First Amendment rights to free expression. Zero-tolerance policies, though hailed by many as tools to bring greater order and discipline to schools, are not without their detractors. In recent years, there have been a number of highly publicized incidents, such as the suspension of a third grader for bringing a butter knife to school, that have made this policy rather controversial. Collectively, these incidents have proved a key point. No school policy can substitute an educator's common sense. Not many years ago, unmarried teachers who became pregnant were routinely dismissed from their teaching positions. Similarly, once a student was discovered to be either married, pregnant, or both, she was dismissed. Pregnant students were considered to be morally corrupting influences on other students, and their presence in the school was seen as legitimizing premature sexual activity and early marriage. Although many people still hold these values, the courts have tended in recent years to see such dismissals as discriminatory to young women and as a denial of their rights to an education. As a consequence, most school districts now make arrangements for the education of pregnant students. Nevertheless, vexing issues keep coming up, such as should an obviously pregnant cheerleader be allowed to continue cheering? Overall, the pendulum of judicial decisions seems to be moving away from an emphasis on student rights and back towards positions favoring the authority of the schools. Nevertheless, when dealing with matters that might lead to suspension or expulsion, teachers and administrators should follow these guidelines. Documentation. Before suspension and expulsion can take place, students must be notified of the nature of their offense and the intended punishment. Explanation. The school must give students a clear explanation of the evidence on which the disciplinary charges rest. Opportunity to defend oneself. The school must give students an opportunity to refute the charges before a fair and impartial individual with the decision-making authority. Although few educational theorists living today advocate it, corporal punishment is alive and well in American schools. The Supreme Court has regularly refused to rule on corporal punishment, leaving the issue up to the states. The trend among the states is clearly in favor of banning it. In 1979, only 2 states had banned corporal punishment in public schools, but currently 31 states prohibit it. A number of other states currently have legislation pending that would abolish corporal punishment. Still, many states leave the decision up to the local school districts. In the 2005-2006 school year, 223,190 students were reported to have been subjected to corporal punishment in U.S. schools. What does this situation mean for teachers from a legal point of view? First, they must know the rules established by their state and school district. Second, they must be aware that the courts have ruled that corporal punishment can be administered only under certain conditions. Thus, teachers must be sure they use only moderate and reasonable corporal punishment and use it only to establish discipline. A teacher who severely punishes a child, especially if that punishment results in any permanent disability or disfigurement, is highly liable to a lawsuit. Also, punishment cannot be administered out of spite, revenge, or anger. In ruling on cases of excessive corporal punishment, the court scrutinized the teacher's state of mind and motivation. The instruments of corporal punishment and the locations on the body they can be administered are also matters of concern to the courts. Fists are totally inappropriate, so are switches and canes. Blows must not strike parts of the body where the risk of injury is high. Also, the punishment must be in scale with the crime. No horsewhipping for whispering, for instance. Apparently, the days of the principal's dictum, the beatings will continue until the morale improves, are over. Although corporal punishment is administered by administrators, teachers need to be aware of its important ethical implications. Is it better to paddle a schoolyard bully and keep him in school, or to have legal hearings and separate him from the possibility of further education? One major problem with corporal punishment is that a ruler on the palm of the hand may provoke terror in one student, but is essentially meaningless for the next. Conversely, non-corporal punishment, such as the prolonged separation of an offending student from classmates, may cause true psychic pain for some children. The entire idea of dealing with disruptive and offending students needs careful thought and even more careful actions. Until these issues are settled definitely, it is imperative for new teachers to become thoroughly conservative with their district's policies concerning punishment for student offenses. Many students, even students of junior high and elementary ages, possess and sell illegal drugs. Schools have drug problems because American youth culture is inundated with images of drug use. Drugs are only one problem that poses questions relating to search and seizure in schools. However, despite the risks of suspension or expulsion resulting from many schools' zero-tolerance policies, students also bring alcohol, pornography, and even dangerous weapons to school. As a result, school administrators may be urged to step up their searches of student possession of drugs, alcohol, weapons, and other illegal items. A student's locker may be searched by an appropriate school official, usually an administrator, if there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the locker contains something illegal or dangerous. The New York state courts have gone further in stating that not only have the school authorities the right to inspect, but the right becomes a duty when suspicion arises that something of an illegal nature may be secreted there. At the same time, courts have found that policies under which school personnel systematically spot check lockers and hunts for drugs, weapons, and other illicit materials violate students' rights under the Fourth Amendment and therefore are illegal. In the world outside school, authorities must have probable cause, that is, a substantial reason for believing that the person is in possession of something illegal, to conduct any kind of search of person or possessions. Yet, because schools are specifically designed for the education and supervision of minors, courts have often allowed schools to use greater latitude in their searches. These decisions have been in keeping with the principle of in loco parentis, the notion that schools act in the place of the parents during the school day. Schools may merely need to demonstrate a reasonable suspicion that a student was in a possession of an illegal substance to conduct a search of that student rather than demonstrating the probable cause that law enforcement officials would need to demonstrate under similar circumstances in non-school settings. The importance of reasonableness in cases of search and seizure was shown by the 1985 Supreme Court ruling in New Jersey versus TLO. In this case, a teacher found two high school girls smoking in the bathroom and immediately brought them to the assistant vice principal's office. One girl admitted to smoking, but the second denied not only smoking on this occasion, but also even being a smoker. The administrator asked the second student to come to his office, where he opened her purse and discovered a pack of cigarettes, cigarette rolling papers, marijuana, a pipe, empty plastic bags, a wad of bills, and a list of names entitled "People Who Owe Me Money." Entered the police. The student was turned over to the juvenile court, where she was judged to be delinquent. She appealed on the basis that the search of her purse had violated her constitutional rights, and therefore the evidence against her had been obtained illegally. This case eventually made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the student lost. The court stated the legality of a search of a student should depend simply on the reasonableness under all the circumstances of the search. Reasonableness appears to be determined first by whether the search has been initiated by reasonable suspicion. In this case, having seen rolling papers, it was reasonable for the school administrator to look for marijuana, given that the two are so often closely related. The second criterion for reasonableness is that the search's scope and conduct must be reasonably related to the circumstances that gave rise to the search. Further, school officials must take into consideration the age and gender of the student and the nature of the offense. The distinction between reasonable suspicion and probable cause is a fine line that is not always crystal clear. The prudent guideline for schools when conducting searches is that any invasive search would require probable cause, whereas less invasive searches would not require as rigorous a standard. In the later cases, reasonable suspicion would suffice. Mistakes here, particularly in the case of unwarranted strip searches, can be not only painfully embarrassing to the students, but also very expensive for the school district. In 2009, the Supreme Court released a ruling in the rather sensational case of a 13-year-old middle school student who was strip searched by school authorities. The girl was alleged to be selling prescription-strength ibuprofen pills. First, had her backpack and outer garments searched, finding no pills, even in the face of the girl's assertion of innocence. The school assistant principal was convinced she had pills hidden on her person. He therefore directed two female school employees to search her in the nurse's office. The search of her bra and her panties exposed her breasts and to some degree her pelvic area. No pills were found, and the girl sued. The court's ruling was a split decision. Yes, the girl's rights had been violated, not by the first searches, but by the intrusive body search. However, in this case, the school district received a pass. The school and the assistant principal were given immunity because their motives were impelled by a desire to protect students from the dangers of drugs. The police, on the other hand, do not have the same custodial relationship, the same kinds of responsibility towards students that officials do. Therefore, as a general rule, police need a warrant and the consent of school officials to search individual students or their lockers. Most people have heard of potential employees or Olympic athletes taking tests to see whether they have any illegal drugs in their system. Can schools decide to administer such kinds of drug testing for those who go out for sports teams? In the late 1980s, the Vernonia School District of Oregon noted a surge in students' use of drugs. Athletics, in particular, were leaders in this drug culture. In response, the school decided to institute random urinalysis to spot check for drug use among the athletes. All students who signed up for a team were required to provide their own and their parents' written consent for testing. In 1991, a 7th grader, James Acton, signed up to play football but was denied participation on the team because he and his parents refused to provide the test consent forms. The family sued, claiming that the drug testing was an invasion of student privacy and an illegal search. The case eventually was decided in the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the Vernonia School District. The justices took into consideration several of the district's arguments, including observations that athletes participate in any number of activities, from suiting up in the locker room to preseason physical exams that reasonably decrease their expectations of privacy, and that the drug test was relatively unobtrusive. The court also considered the severity of the need based on the widespread student drug use and ruled that the policy was reasonable and constitutional. In its ruling, however, the court cautioned against assuming that suspicionless drug testing would be constitutional in all other situations. It indicated that in this case, the most salient factor was that the school district was enacting its governmental responsibilities in monitoring and supervising school children entrusted in its care. In 2002, the court significantly broadened its ruling to include not just athletes, but all students engaged in competitive extracurricular activities, be they football or debating. The ruling reaffirmed and stressed the school's custodial responsibility. Because search and seizure touches upon such fundamental American rights, schools will probably always need to be vigilant about how school policies and practices align with constitutional rights. The right to say what we want, where we want, is the cornerstone of a free society, and as such, it is near and dear to Americans. As Justice William O. Douglas stated, restriction of free thought and speech and free speech is the most dangerous of all supervisions. It is the one un-American act that would most easily defeat us. Despite U.S. courts' vigilant protection of this right, however, it is not an absolute right. The great Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that freedom of speech does not give a person the right to yell fire in a crowded theater or to knowingly and maliciously say or write lies that damage the reputation of another. In schools, freedom of expression must be balanced with the school's responsibility to maintain a safe and orderly environment and to protect people's feelings and reputations. During the 1960s and early 70s, many social protests and anti-war demonstrations spilled over into the schools, and particularly into high schools. In one case, Tinkerhurst, in one independent community school district, students who had been suspended for wearing anti-war armbands took the issue to court, claiming that the school had interfered with their right to freedom of expression. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the students, stating that their black armbands were a form of symbolic speech in protest of the Vietnam War and should not be prohibited. A key point in this affirmation of students' First Amendment rights was the passive and non-destructive nature of the students' protest. According to the court, there was no evidence wherein the armbands would materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the schools. During the 70s and 80s, the Tinker case was often cited, but the title of court opinion in favor of students' right to free speech soon began to turn. In the 1986 case of Bethel School District Number 403 versus Frazier, Matthew Frazier, a high school student in Bethel, Washington, nominated another student for vice president of the student government in a formal speech at an assembly before 600 students. Despite the warning of two teachers, Frazier built his speech on an elaborate, graphic, and explicit sexual metaphor, comparing the nominee to a sexual organ. The court records of this case fail to tell us the outcome of the election, but Frazier got the axe. He was suspended for 3 days and removed from the list of candidates to speak at graduation. Frazier sued and won initially, but when the case went to the Supreme Court, he lost by a 7-2 decision. The court affirmed the school's right to establish standards of civic and mature conduct and to enforce them. The definition of students' right to free speech was further refined in the 2007 Supreme Court ruling Morris v. Frederick. Joseph Frederick, A high school student in Juneau, Alaska, was suspended for school for 10 days when he unfurled a large banner, "Bong Hits for Jesus," across the street from the school when the Olympic Torch Parade went through Juneau en route to the 2002 Winter Games in Salt Lake City. Frederick claimed that it was a prank, a stunt to ensure that he and his mates got on television. As a public relations event, the act was a resounding success. The school principal and eventually the majority of the Supreme Court saw the banner as advocating, or at least celebrating, illegal drug use. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, "The First Amendment does not require schools to tolerate at school events student expression that contributes to those dangers." Although something of a worrisome ruling for high school pranksters across the land, this ruling reaffirmed the authority of school officials in the matter. Newspapers have long been arenas for struggles over freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Often, the very best efforts to make school papers vital and relevant draw newspaper staffs into controversies. This is what happened at Hazelwood East High School in the spring of 1983. Attempting to make their paper, The Spectrum, speak more directly to the real issues confronting their fellow students, the staff submitted 2 controversial articles, one dealing with the personal accounts of 3 Hazelwood students who had become pregnant, and one focusing on divorce and its effect on students. In line with standard practice, the advisor and teacher of the journalism class that produced the paper passed the issue on to the principal for his approval. The principal eliminated the 2 pages containing the offending stories and sent the other 4 pages to the printer. In response, Kathy Kohlmeyer and the 6 other journalism students sued, contending that their freedom of speech rights had been violated. Eventually, in 1988, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the school district. Although dissenting justices complained about the potential for thought control and the denuding of high school students of much of the First Amendment protection that Tinker in itself described, the majority supported the principal's actions as legal and responsible. As stated in the majority opinion, a school may in its capacity as publisher of a school newspaper or producer of a school newspaper or producer of a school play disassociate itself not only from speech that would substantially interfere with its works or impinge on the rights of other students, but also from speech that is, for example, ungrammatical, poorly written, inadequately researched, biased, prejudiced, vulgar or profane, or unsustainable for immature audiences. A school need not tolerate speech that is inconsistent with its basic educational mission, even though the government could not censor similar speech outside the school. Taken together, the 3 cases we have just discussed, Tinker versus Des Moines, Bethel versus Fraser, and Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer, suggest that freedom of speech and expression in schools is hardly absolute. Students may be punished for offensive or disruptive speech or publications. Schools, then, are something like justice homes, crowded theaters, and students' freedom of speech is somewhat limited. Students can and should express themselves, but in an orderly and nonviolent way. For its part, the school has the right and reasonability to ensure that language is not used to hurt or scandalize the students in its charge. One cutting-edge freedom speech issue involves the internet. As discussed in Chapter 7, what should teachers know about technology and its impact on schools? The internet can be a marvelous educational tool, opening up almost infinite intellectual resources to students. At the same time, it can expose students to written and visual pornography, obscenity through email, electronic bullying, and chat room predators. Many school districts have been struggling to respond to these dangers without underlying restricting students' exploration of the electronic world beyond the school. Among the responses currently in place are orientation programs and appropriate use of the internet, more careful supervision of computer stations, and special softwares designed to block forbidden sites. Many districts have acceptable use policies that provide rules of the road for students using this technology. In a dated but still landmark study entitled Hostile Hallways, the American Association of University Women reported in 1993 that 81% of U.S. students acknowledged that they were the subjects of sexual harassment at some time during their school lives. Only 11% reported the incident to a teacher. 1/4 of the girls and 1/10 of the boys reported being harassed by a school employee. Most harassment, however, was of the student-to-student variety. Teenage girls responded to the survey with stories of pervasive and overt sexual harassment. Girls describe sexual jokes and taunts, attempts to snap their bras, lift their skirts, and grope their bodies, and other unwanted physical attention. Boys and girls get the message that girls are not worthy of respect and that it is okay for boys to exert power over girls. Spreading sexual rumors and calling a person gay or lesbian were often reported verbal forms of harassment. Most of the harassment occurred in plain view of others, in hallways, lunchrooms, classrooms, assemblies, and playgrounds, and on school buses. Since the study first appeared, schools have attempted to address this abuse, focusing in particular on student-to-student harassment. The study's definition of sexual harassment is unwanted and unwelcome sexual behavior which interferes with your life. Of course, that constitutes sexual harassment in a particular situation can be a thorny issue. For instance, in 1996, a North Carolina school suspended a 6-year-old boy who had kissed a female classmate on the cheek, claiming that he committed sexual harassment. Conversely, many readers may know of truly serious and frightening harassment incidents from their own school experience. One such incident was the subject of a Supreme Court ruling in Davis v. Monroe County Board of Education. When LaShonda Davis was in 5th grade in Forsyth, Georgia, her harassment nightmare began. A fellow student began groping her, grinding up against her, and declaring that he was going to get in bed with her. The girl and her parents made repeated complaints to her teacher and the school principal. After 5 months, the teacher finally agreed to move the boy's desk to the other side of the room, but the sexual taunting and lewd overturns continued until finally the family sought legal counsel. 6 years after the initial incident, and with much legal work, the suit finally made its way to the Supreme Court. The court, in a controversial 5-4 decision, ruled for the Davises and against the school district. What has made this case legally controversial is the perceived danger of our courts being flooded with cases ranging from innocuous flirtations to true hardcore harassment. Further, judges worry that the budgets of school districts will be drained by the legal expenses involved in fighting frivolous suits. In the prevailing opinion, the Davis decision stresses that school districts are liable only if they were deliberately indifferent to inform about severe, persuasive, and objectively offensive harassment among students. It appears that although the court has some to the defense of harassed students, the criteria for what actually constitutes an offense has been set quite high. Nevertheless, the problem of sexual harassment in our schools appears to be growing. In particular, whether there's a response to the new societal openness to same-gender sexuality or some other reason, the harassment of gay and lesbian students has increased significantly in recent years. Schools that formerly had taken this issue casually are now working to respond to it more seriously. Schools can work to avoid the problem by drafting a sexual harassment policy, requiring training programs for administrators, teachers, and students, acting quickly when confronted with sexual harassment, enlisting the support of parents, and instituting disciplinary actions against repeat harassers. Many schools now have sexual harassment policies that they distribute to students and staff. However, as the AAUW study revealed, neither boys nor girls are likely to report actual incidents to adults for fear of being labeled a snitch or suffering repercussions. The challenge for educators is to change the culture of harassment in schools and to encourage the use of existing resources to address the problem. All our students, boys and girls, have the right to attend schools whose environments are free from such harassment. As a teacher, you cannot ignore such instances when you see them occur. Choose to make such times teachable moments by helping students learn to appreciate the dignity of others and ensuring that the classroom is a welcoming environment for all students. Table 8.3 summarizes the Davis case along with other major students' rights discussed in the preceding sections. In this information age, most of us probably have a digital history tucked away on some kind of computer disk or stored in the cloud. For students, this history may consist of school records, various test scores, and ratings by teachers on everything from citizenship to punctuality. Teachers and other staff members judge a student's character and potential, and others use those judgments to decide whether the student should go to this school or get that job. Certainly, we need some system for exchanging information about one another. Otherwise, we would only hire our friends or attend only those schools where enough people knew us to vouch for us. Unfortunately, the kind of information in school records may be highly imperfect, and the danger that it will be misinterpreted or fall into the wrong hands is great. In the early 1970s, a series of situations came to light in which information was poorly used or in which parents and students were denied access to records. In response, the U.S. Congress passed the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act in 1974. The act, also known as the Buckley Amendment, outlines who may see a student's record and under what conditions. Parents who previously were kept from many of the officially recorded judgments that affected their children's futures are the clear winners as a result of this legislation. The Buckley Amendment states that federal funds will be denied to a school if it prevents parents from exercising the right to inspect and review their child's educational records. Parents must receive an explanation or interpretation of the records if they so request. However, the Buckley Amendment does not give parents the right to see a teacher or administrator's unofficial records. For instance, a teacher's private diary of a class's progress or private notes about a particular child may not be inspected without the teacher's consent. Although the Buckley Amendment has undoubtedly reduced the potential for abuse of information, it has had a somewhat chilling effect on teachers and others' willingness to be candid in their judgments when writing student recommendations for jobs or colleges. Because students may elect to see a teacher's letter of recommendation, some teachers choose to play it safe and write it vague. A general letter that lacks discriminating judgments, pro or con, about a student. In effect, some faculty members and other recommenders have adopted the attitude, well, if a student doesn't trust me enough to let me write a confidential recommendation, I'll simply write an adequate, safe recommendation. Nevertheless, the Buckley Amendment impact, in our view, has largely been positive. In the past, many students lost opportunities for higher education on desirable jobs because of inaccurate statements and recommendations or in their school records. One professor reported to us that an incident that occurred in his school in 1975, shortly after the Buckley Amendment came into being. Our counselors at the junior high school where I taught were purging the records of subjective comments with black markers. In one student's permanent record folder, a Playboy magazine fell out. It seems the grade school teacher took it from Carl and included it in his permanent record because she wanted future teachers to know what kind of kid Carl really was. Despite the fact that the Buckley Amendment is now 40 years old, its implications for what constitutes a violation of student right to privacy concerning his or her educational records are not always apparent. The fact was made all too clear in the fall of 2001 when the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case involving students' right to privacy. An Oklahoma mother, Krista Falvo, fought suit against the Owasso Independent School District for violating the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Her son's classroom teacher asked the students to grade one another's quizzes and to call out the grades so the teacher could record them. The mother argued that such a practice violated her son's right to privacy because the practice publicly disclosed educational information about him. Miss Falvo was especially concerned that this practice would have a detrimental effect on his learning. In a 2002 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the school district, stating that peer grading is not in violation of the Buckley Amendment. End of chapter 8.